I am Larry Scott, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm a recovered alcoholic, and I'm free tonight. My sobriety date is December 31st, 1987, and I want to thank the 7th chapter. I especially want to thank Tyler and Randy. These guys have been off the hook, hosting us and showing us Southern California. We get the pleasure of doing this all over the place, and we've been in Southern California now twice since October, and we got a lot of home folk down here, and it's good to feel at home. My mama said, if you didn't feel at home, you ought to be at home, and I feel at home here, and that's a good thing. We're going to have some fun this weekend. This is anything but a stuffy, boring deal, and we're going to say that if you need a drink of water, go get it. If you need to let some water out, go do it. You're not going to bother us. And we are going to take a 10-minute break on the hour, or within the hour. They won't be punctual. We ought never be organized. And we will be starting up at 10 minutes at the end of the 10-minute break. If you're still out there being a yeehaw and smoking cigarettes and telling lies, that's on you. But we got an airplane waiting on us, so we're going to have to be on the clock. But we are going to have some fun this weekend. And so glad that you guys are here.
Hey, everybody, I'm Charlie Gow, and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date's January 11th, 1994. And through the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, my life changed. Old Larry Boy always introduces himself and says that he's free tonight. Well, I too am free, and I have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. I don't do that to boast my ego. I give it to all praise to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the God of my understanding. I have done nothing but try to do what was laid out by the forefathers that came before me. I take no credit for anything. And Larry Boy and I pray a lot before we do these things. And like he said, the Lord blesses us, and we get to go all over the world. And to be able to sit with you good folks tonight in Orange County, California, and be hosted by Chapter 7 is just so humbling, words can't express it to me. You see, this is all still new to me. I want to soak every bit of it up. I hope I had a good, he's gone now, but I probably wasn't 90 days sober, and there was an old man in Savannah, Georgia, had 37 years, and I asked, I'd heard in a meeting or two something about that pink cloud, you better have that pink parachute, all that. So I asked him, I said, well, this stuff is just, I love it. Just when can I expect for this pink cloud to bust or whatever? And he said, Charlie boy, I can only share with you what I know. He said, and I know you can ride this pink cloud 37 years, 8 months, and 4 days. Now, you'll have to come back and see me tomorrow, and I'll tell you if you can ride it 37 years, 4 months, and 5 days. And that gave me a lot of hope. I don't have to have downtime in Alcoholics Anonymous. And these places Larry and I get to go, what we get to share, is in the black part of the book of Alcoholics Anonymous. You'll hear us, if we have an opinion, we'll be sure to tell you it is our opinion. Through the essence of time, we can't go through every page and every word that's in the first 164 pages of the book or the stories. Time just won't allow it. So if we skip around some, it's only because the essence of time. We say that every word is important. And so, and I imagine in your big book studies around here, you use every word. But if we ask you to go to another page and another paragraph, it's just emphasizing something that we have learned and we're trying to share with you. So with that, I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here and And we just got through thanking our Lord for giving us the opportunity to be together again. And Larry Scott's my hero, and we just do this thing just because the Lord's shining on us. And I want to be sure that everyone in this room knows that. I'm not here because of my ego. I'm here because hopefully God's given me a chance to do something. I'm trying to fulfill that job that He's required of me today.
As this weekend progresses, you'll understand that neither one of us came from pomp and circumstance. We are both pretty much homeless guys. 24 years ago today, I was homeless in the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. And never in my wildest dream did I realize that we would be here in Southern California presenting in the footsteps of Joe McQuaney and Charlie Parmalee. I never dreamed it. I never dreamed that Charlie Parmalee would visit my home group. I never dreamed that Charlie Parmalee would pass the torch to me. Just never dreamed it. So, before we get all snotty-nosed, this is not an AA meeting. This is a big book study, so if your sponsor said you needed to catch a meeting today, hopefully you can catch one about 9 o'clock tonight, because this ain't it. If you've got a cell phone, we ask you to please turn it off. You can check Facebook and all that business on the break, please. If you don't have a pen or a highlighter, you're going to need one, and because you're going to need it during the course of this deal. And I'm going to reiterate the smokers announcement because it's a bullet point on my format here. We're invited guests at this facility, and according to Tyler, this church has gone above and beyond to accommodate us. So let's leave this place, as all other places that we visit, better than we found it, and adhere to their requests. We've asked a friend to read the preamble, and as you folks go to read this, we're going to ask you to use the mic in the back. And a couple of things about these readings. We use these because at most meetings you'll hear the first part of 5th chapter, and you'll hear the 12 traditions, and then you'll hear what the fellowship has coined the promises, which are the 9-step promises. And if you've been around here a minute, you start hearing, rarely have we seen a person fail. You look at your watch and you say, well, I got 3 minutes to go burn one, or I can tune this deal out. Well, you're not going to hear that tonight. There's nothing wrong with those readings. The first 2 readings, the preamble and the tradition statement, are taken from the 9th tradition in the 12 and 12. And the 3rd reading is called What Happened. What Happened was penned by a guy named Cliff Bishop. He was a protege of Joe McQuaney, lives in Dallas, Texas. He is one of the founders of the primary purpose groups, which are all over the world now. And originally, this was a 3-page document. And we loved it so much, we called Cliff and asked his permission to kind of digest it down to fit our format. And he gave us his grace on that. Anything that is read tonight, anything that's covered this weekend, if you want copies of it that are not in your handouts, we're going to flash our email addresses up and our phone numbers. Contact us and we'll get those things out to you. So whoever has the preamble, we'd ask you to go to the microphone in the middle there and share that with us, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ken, and I am an alcoholic. Preamble. Unless we, as AA members, follow to the best of our ability the suggested 12 steps of recovery, we almost certainly sign our own death warrant. Our drunkenness and disillusion are not penalties inflicted by people in authority. Instead, they result from our personal disobedience toward spiritual principles.
Thank you. And another friend has agreed to read the tradition statement.
Aaron, alcoholic. Aaron. AA must function, but at the same time it must avoid the dangers of great wealth, prestige, and entrenched power which necessarily tempts other societies. Although our traditions at first sight seem to deal with purely practical matters, the actual operation they disclose is a society without organization, animated only by the spirit of service, a true fellowship.
Thank you. Another friend has agreed to read What Happened.
You might have to adjust it for me. Thank you. I'm Charlotte, and I'm alcoholic.
Charlotte.
What happened?
That question is being asked by a lot of alcoholics lately. What happened to our success rate? The foreword to the second edition acknowledges a 75% success rate. Today's numbers are much less. The problem is we are no longer showing the newcomer that we have a solution to alcoholism. We aren't telling them how important the Big Book is. Instead, we are using our meetings for drunkalogs, discussion of our problems, our ideas, and opinions. We're telling newcomers just don't drink and go to meetings. Don't rush into taking the steps. Take your time, and that relapse is part of recovery. Most meetings have turned into misery traps for newcomers and those who depend upon discussion and participation type meetings. What is the solution? We are placing the focus back on the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. We need to tell the newcomer that there is a solution. We have had a spiritual awakening as the result of taking the 12 steps. And this is the message we need to be passing on. Today, there are groups of recovered alcoholics that are starting meetings based upon the fifth tradition to pass on the message of Alcoholics Anonymous in its purest form, directly from the Big Book. That is our mission here.
Thank you, Charlotte. The disclaimer for this weekend is that Charlie and I are students of the Big Book. We're not gurus, experts, or authorities. We're not here to rewrite the book. We simply want to share with you what we have discovered about this book and what has been passed on to us by those that have gone before, primarily Joe and Charlie. If you have a difference of opinion or a different experience, we'd be glad to talk to you about it on the break or after the meeting. We speak a different language down in the South. I guess y'all could figure that out by now. And if we say something that doesn't make sense, if we rush something, if we blurb something, we both have tongues in our mouths and they get in the way sometimes. Just raise your hand and stop us. And if you have a question, for the sake of the recording, we'd ask you to use that microphone if you have a question so that the CD will pick it up and it can be passed on to those in CD land out there. But don't let that deter you from asking a question. When I was taught this format or this method of book study, great big guy, Rob Hayes, was teaching. He was going over some stuff one night, and he looked at me, he says, "You hadn't got a clue what I'm talking about, do you?" And I said, "No." He said, "You better raise your hand. You're going to walk out of here dumb and drunk." My male pride and ego wouldn't allow me to let him know that I didn't understand. But he snapped me out of that, and we beg you to please, if there's something that's unclear, something doesn't make sense, stop us. All right, we're going to click into this little overhead deal now. You know, Tyler, I'm intimidated that you're here because you're going to catch me fumbling around with this computer. I watched your little prowess last night. You know what you know about getting around the computer, buddy. We're going to start this thing out by reciting the set-aside prayer. It's up on the screen. So when you're ready. Ready? Dear God, please set aside everything I think and know about myself, about my disease, about the Big Book, about the 12 steps of the program, about the fellowship, and all spiritual terms, especially you, God. Do this that I may have an open mind and new experience with all these things. Please help me to see the truth. Amen.
We certainly want to give credit where credit's due, so we're going to give you a little bit of history of how God worked and got Larry and I sitting in these two chairs. And I'm going to read a little bit of something.
She's asking if you can bring the images down a little bit, Tyler.
You won't need it for this while Tyler's working on that. And what it is just how we got here, how Larry and I got here together. And Joe McQuaney and Charlie Pomerly met in 1973 when Joe introduced Charlie as a AA speaker at the Al-Anon convention. Now, Joe wondered if Charlie might be that country western singer, Charlie Pride. Well, he wasn't even the right color, Joe admits. They instantly discovered their mutual fascination with the AA's basic text, the Big Book. Now, what interested them the most was that the Big Book was written in a particular sequence to convey certain ideas. That interest began a close friendship which lasted Joe McQuaney died in, 02?
No, he died about 07.
07. And Charlie Pomerly, we lost him April of last year. So that, 30-year friendship was there. That interest began a close friendship which lasted those 30 years. They would frequently meet to discuss the book, often driving 225 miles to meet each other in others' homes. Ironically, Larry and I live about 225 miles away from each other. I live in Savannah, Georgia, and Larry lives in Marietta. He lives in about the middle of the state, and I live down on the coast, so go figure. Soon they were planning meetings in hotel rooms at AA's conventions in Oklahoma and Arkansas, and within a few years, the meetings grew in popularity. In 1977, some members met in Tulsa, Oklahoma hotel room for a discussion of the Big Book. One asked Joe and Charlie to come to his home group to present a program on the book. An AA taper made 4 tape sets of their presentation and called it the Big Book Study. The tapes were gradually circulated throughout the fellowship, and invitations were received for Joe and Charlie to present the study at AA conventions, roundups, and special events. By 1980, there had been about 8 studies offered. At the 1980 International AA Convention in New Orleans, Wesley Parrish, an impassive Big Book thumper from Pompano Beach, Florida, organized a lunch for about 1,500 AAs all over the world and gave away 100 Joe and Charlie tape sets as door prizes. Invitations exploded, and within a couple of years, Joe and Charlie were presenting about 36 studies a year wide. Excuse me. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Obviously, the seminars struck a deep chord within AA members. For the reaffirmation of this message, as it was written in 1939 with the publication of the first edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Joe and Charlie traveled throughout the United States as well as many countries all over the world.
In the early 90s, brothers Dante and Rick Rajanti from Atlanta were taught this method of study by Joe and Charlie. They in turn taught my sponsorship family and myself. At the end of the 6 months with us, we met every Tuesday night at a little treatment center in Atlanta. They gave us the charge to carry this message. Since that time, opportunities to present this information in various countries have arisen. In January 2011, my longtime friend Charlie Yao of Savannah, Georgia, joined the book study team. Charlie has great experience and knowledge of our history, having served as archive chair for the state of Georgia in the State Service Office, and is frequently a featured speaker at conferences all over. Charlie has a passion for the book, bringing with him an abundance of love and excitement. This weekend, we give you the charge to carry this message. That's why it's so important that you have a pen and a highlighter. Don't keep this information, because as you teach it, you learn it. When these guys got finished teaching us, it was on a Tuesday night, and Rob Hayes called me up on a Thursday, and he said, I can't be at the Triangle Club tonight, and I'm in the middle of the book, and I need somebody to pick up the slack. And I said, yeah, but, and he hung up. And I showed up over there, and there was about 150 people in the room, and I was extremely intimidated. And opened the book, and it came off pretty good. There was no blood drawn, and nobody died. And every week since then, I've done as many as 3 of these things in Atlanta, and we did about 20 of them last year, and we got about 14 of them so far going this year. And my home group is We Are Not a Glum Lot in Atlanta, Georgia. And we have an average of 250 people, mostly women. It was grounded and founded by women. And it's this book study. The only difference is we don't skip around in the book. We read everything that's black from the blank page all the way through the end of 164, including Dr. Bob's Nightmare. Is this loud or is it just me? I feel like I got a bad cold. I feel okay, but I feel like I got a bad cold.
You look like you got a bad cold.
All right.
He cuter than a speckled pup.
All right. We begin, and all these things that we're going over tonight will not be covered again tomorrow for the sake of time. We do a thing called the alcoholic puzzle. Joe and Charlie did something very similar to this, but they went into a lot more detail about the medical estimate and that. And the reason we do this is there are people that show up in our rooms that are hard drinkers or unsure as to whether they're the real deal or not. And in our place, we get a lot of people that are sentenced to our meetings, as I'm sure you do out here by the appearance of court cards and that. And the first part of this puzzle is called the problem. That's why we're here. The first component of the problem is called the obsession of the mind. We're real big on the meaning of words, and if you look up the meaning of obsession, it'll tell you it's a thought that overrides all other thoughts. Very simply put, when the thought of drinking alcohol enters into my mind, it overrides everything. It overrides my companionship and my friendship with you. It overrides those two little old dogs back home that I love so much. It overrides those two motorcycles sitting in my garage begging me to ride them. It overrides the thought of my business that God gave me. It overrides the existence of God in my life and His presence. It overrides everything. And what happens is the argument begins in my head. And when the argument begins, I can't win it. I've lost it every time. Every time. I've never won it, whether or not I'm going to drink. And then I grab a bottle of liquor and I start pouring it down my neck, and it sets into motion the second component of the disease. It's called the allergy of the body. The word allergy is an abnormal reaction to something. There are people in this room tonight probably that have an allergic reaction to gluten. They can't eat a bologna sandwich like we can. They can't eat pasta like we can. They can't eat. I was engaged to a girl that had a gluten allergy, and they brought out a salad one night, and we asked them to leave the croutons off, and they didn't. And I said, Susan, let me send it back. She says, no, it'll be okay. And she picked them off, these big old chunks of bread, and set them off to the side. But what happened, a crumb fell off of one of those croutons, and she ingested it. We ended up taking her to the hospital that night for a crumb because her body had an abnormal reaction to a wheat substance, to gluten. And there are other people that have allergic reactions to different prescription drugs, penicillin, for instance, tetracycline. The allergic reaction that we have to alcohol as real alcoholics is once we begin to drink, we cannot stop because we don't have the chemical makeup to metabolize alcohol the way that a normal drinker or normal human being does. And what happens is once I start to drink, get out the almanac because I'm going to be gone a while. I don't know. I quit for two reasons. I've got to be separated from alcohol in order to stop. Either I've got to be locked up behind bars to where I can't get to it, or I die in the street. We were doing a workshop one time a couple of years ago, and this guy said, well, I quit when I run out of money. Home your business. And I took what belonged to you and turned it into what I had to have to continue that run. I'd drink no matter what. Okay? Second part of the puzzle is the solution. If the problem is powerlessness, the solution is found in power. Well, where do you find the solution? Well, it's found in the spiritual nature. Well, that's cool, Larry, but where do you find the spiritual solution? Well, it's found in the third part of the puzzle. It's called a practical program of action, and it's outlined, as the book says, in masterly detail within the first 164 pages of our text.
Now, whose responsibility is this to carry this on? We're going to read a couple little excerpts from our co-founders. And this is a letter Bill Wilson wrote in 1966. And Bill penned, "This is why sobriety, freedom from alcohol, through the teachings and practice of AA's 12 steps, is the sole purpose of the group. If we don't stick to these cardinal principles, we shall almost certainly collapse. And if we collapse, we cannot help anyone. He asked our other co-founder, Dr. Bob, to elaborate on our responsibility statement, and Dr. Bob wrote this. You can find this in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 227. This is what Dr. Bob wrote. He elaborated on this keep it simple theory as far as the AA program is concerned. Incidentally, in a September 1948 article for the Grapevine, he wrote, as finally expressed and offered, they, the 12 steps, are simple in language, plain in meaning. They are also workable by any person having a sincere desire to obtain and keep sobriety. The results are the proof. Their simplicity and workability are such that no special interpretations and certainly no reservations have ever been necessary. And it has become increasingly clear that the degree of harmonious living which we achieve is in direct relation to our earnestness attempt to follow them literally under the divine guidance to the best of our ability. We have a little quote from a famous man in United States, and I don't know if Carl Sandburg was an alcoholic or not, but he wrote, and he kind of summed it up. He said, whenever a civilization or society declines or perishes, there's always one condition present. They forgot where they came from.
And Charlie says that because tonight's going to be, the majority of tonight is going to be spent on how we got here, the history. We do two different versions of this. We do a Friday night and a Saturday version, and it has very little history. And Tyler wanted the whole tamale because he's a drunk, and he wanted the whole deal. So y'all are going to get the whole thing. Did y'all get handouts when you came in? And I apologize to this group because you're going to need them. So we're going to. Are they here? They are here. All right. Let's take a quick second and let them get these things because is the timeline attached? Randy, is the timeline attached to it? Yes, sir. Okay, because in some groups it's a separate deal. And while Randy's getting those things, I want to go back to the two items that Charlie read. Talking about personal responsibility, our responsibility of carrying this message purely. As we travel around the world, typically when a group invites us in, they're enthusiastic about the pure message, and that's what we give. Charlie said when we have an opinion, you'll know it, but they're rare. We don't normally, and the book doesn't need a lot of opinions. But I know out here in California, there's a California four-step that we've heard about. And it just is unbelievable. And we're going to cover this in a few minutes in the preface and the forwards, but the very first group's conscience that AA had, they had three vital issues on the table. One was hospitals, one was a group of missionaries to carry this message, and a book. Well, they didn't have two nickels to rub together, and the first two issues on the table got shot down because there was no money. They didn't have any money to build hospitals, and of course Bill wanted to get this band of merry little missionaries out there, and they didn't have any money. And the printing of the book passed by 2 votes, and the reason it passed is because we print books and we read books. Books are printed information to transmit an idea from one human mind to another. So when I'm unsure about which direction I take, it's all right here. It's all right here. I don't need to go and look in another book. I don't need this. It's like my old sponsor said. I said, the way I interpret these steps, and he cut me off at the knees. He says, these steps don't need your interpreting. They need you doing. And they're very clear here. You know, I was in a meeting Tuesday night, and there's an old buddy of mine. He's on the other side now. He crossed over from an overdose. But his sponsor had him working a step a year. We see how that worked out. He's in a mausoleum somewhere in Stone Mountain, Georgia. The book is very clear with the pace that we do this work, and we'll point that out to you as we go through it this weekend. Another thing is y'all going to see me consume a case of water because I've got an extreme dry mouth problem, amongst other things. In your handouts, you've got this document. It's called the timeline. And I apologize again to the group. I forgot that we were doing this. Typically, we don't do handouts till the next day. This timeline, as you notice, starts out in 1907. And as we well know, the founding date of our fellowship wasn't until June the 10th of 35. And the reason we're going to kick off with 1907, there were some key events. And the very beginning of this timeline, the disclaimer for it, there's not an alcoholic involved. But God, in His infinite wisdom, realized that we were going to need some help. He's been watching us drink and die ever since He created us. And ever since we learned how to crush a grape. There's this guy, his name is Frank Buchman. And this is Frank right here. Frank was he was in Philadelphia, and he was a Lutheran minister. And while he's up in Philadelphia, he had a hospice for wayward boys, homeless boys. Kind of like a YMCA, if you will. And the short version of the story is he got into a run-in with the board of directors over a food budget. Well, his profession is teaching the Word of God. And he got what we know to be a resentment. He got pissed off at these guys, and he got cut off from the sunlight of the Spirit and couldn't preach. So he leaves Philadelphia and heads over to Europe. He gets over to Europe, and he goes over there, and he's going to attend this evangelical conference. Well, he goes into the conference, and the conference is kind of ho-hum and mundane, and he leaves. And he's wandering down the street, and he sees a sign in this building for a lecture given by this lady, Jessie Penn Lewis. And Jessie Penn Lewis, if you Google her, she was an incredible writer and usually wrote religious-type material. And he sits in on this conference, this talk that she's giving. And from her, he learned, he's in Keswick, England, and he learned three things from her. He learned the solution to the resentment. It later became the four absolutes of the Oxford group movement. And this is going to be real confusing to you. This is going to be one of them deals. If you don't get it, stop us and we'll go back. So he learns the solution to this resentment. He gets hooked back up with God. Kind of like what AA does for us when we shut him out with the alcohol. In the year 1918, this guy, Sam Shoemaker, he is in Peking, China. Shoemaker, at the time, is a teacher, and he's trying to teach these Chinese men American ways and American mathematics, and they ain't learning it too good. Well, he gets a resentment at these guys because they're not learning mathematics and American ways. And he is also in school to become a minister. And he gets cut off from the sunlight of the Spirit because he's pissed off at these Chinese men. Well, he runs into Buchman, and Buchman says, "Hey, dude, I got something for your resentment." And he shares the information with him. He tells him about the four absolutes. And the four absolutes, if you go to Akron, Ohio for Founders Day, anybody here ever been to Founders Day? You know, up there, the presence and the prominence of the four absolutes is bigger than the 12 steps. If you go to Dr. Bob's grave, they've got a piece of granite there with the four absolutes on it because they were so very, very important early on. And the four absolutes are honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And those are the things that Buchman learned from Jessie Penn Lewis. He shares this information with Sam Shoemaker, and Shoemaker decided to let go of self and let God guide his life. This is in 1918. Still not a drunk on the map. These are just, yes, ma'am. Could you go to that mic? I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the four absolutes, please?
Yes. The four absolutes: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And I've actually sat down with those four words, and if you look at them really close, you can derive all of our 12 steps from those four words. You got them? Good.
And what you can also derive from those four words is the absence of defects of character. There's no defects of character in that way of living.
All right, it's 1921. Shoemaker becomes ordained, and he becomes the minister of Calvary Church in New York City. In 2010, me and my partner at the time, Christian, were invited to go to Calvary Church, which was where the Oxford group met. It's where Bill Wilson went to his first meetings. And to walk into that church was just overwhelming. I cried for the first night. We were in the room where the Oxford groups met. But anyway, he goes to Calvary Church. And at Calvary Church, it's in Gramercy Park. And then they got Calvary House, which is a 52-bed halfway house for alcoholic men, and Calvary Mission, which was like a soup kitchen for the homeless. And he goes there, and they started a movement called the First Century Christianity Movement. Now, the First Century Christianity Movement was nothing more than the early name for the Oxford Group movement, which was adopted some years later in Oxford, England. That's another story. By the way, nothing that we're covering right now will keep you sober for 10 seconds, but it's kind of interesting. Okay? All right, it's 1931, and there's this cat in Akron, Ohio. His name is Russell Bud Firestone. That's him standing up in that picture there. He is the heir to the great Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in Akron. And the problem with Bud is he liked to drink liquor and show himself. And he's out in Denver, Colorado, and he gets on this train headed back to Akron. Well, he runs into Sam Shoemaker and this cat named Jim Newton. And he's pretty loaded, and they kind of figure out who he is, and they said, would you like to quit drinking liquor for good and all? And he said, well, yeah, I would. And they got him in a club car, got him on his knees, and they did a first-step surrender on him. Well, that was kind of a groundbreaking deal, and he gets so we've been to Philadelphia, we've been to Keswick, England, we've been to Peking, China, we're in New York City, and now we're on a train coming back from Denver. Skip down 1931, the middle of the page. There's a cat named Roland. Well, this is Sam Shoemaker and Jim Newton. These are the two guys that basically 12th step. Russell Bud Firestone. There's this cat named Roland Hazard. That's him on that side. Roland Hazard is a filthy rich white-collar industrialist. He comes from a family that's got enough money to burn a wet dog. I mean, these boys have got some money. They own Burlington Industries, Allied Signal, Allied Chemical. He came from a family of politicians. Roland was senator of the state of Rhode Island, governors and senators and mayors and you name it. The problem was he liked to drink red liquor and show himself. And he ends up over in Switzerland, and he had consulted a bunch of American psychiatrists, as y'all know from reading the book. But he stumbled in, and he got hooked up with this guy named Dr. Carl Jung. And the first guy he wanted to hook up with was Sigmund Freud, and Freud was new and he was the hot deal, kind of like Dr. Phil, and you couldn't get in to see him. And then the second guy he wanted to hook up with was a cat named Alfred Adler. And Adler was getting old, and he wasn't taking on any new patients. And we need to thank God every day for this, because he hooked up with Jung. Because you see, the first two guys, his first two choices were both atheists. And Jung told him, he says, alcoholics of your type normally die dead in the street. He said, but every once in a while, now and then, they have what we call a vital, which means life-sustaining spiritual experience. So this is the first link in the chain of events that came to be Alcoholics Anonymous. The issue with this, he knew what the solution was, but he didn't know what the problem was. You know what I'm saying? My friend Sam here, right, he got a garage full of Harley-Davidson motorcycles. And if one of them starts spitting and sputtering, Sam knows a little bit about motorcycles, but he's probably a lot like me. He'd pull that plug out to see if it was fouled. Or he might want to go and dump the gas and put some new gas in it. He can't fix that problem. He can't fix it until he knows what the problem is. He's got to know what to attack. And what Roland was suffering from was alcoholism. Up to this point in time, they're giving us lobotomies and shock treatments and you name it and locking us away. But he knew what the solution was if he could just have this vital spiritual experience. Skip down to the bottom of 1931. There's this cat named Dr. William Duncan Silkworth. They call him the little doctor who loved drunks. He's not an alcoholic. He was a neurologist, brain surgeon over at Bellevue. He lost his shirt like the rest of our country in 1929 stock crash. He wandered over to Charles B. Towns, which is a cat from Claxton, Georgia, that had opened up an early spin dry in New York City called Towns Hospital. And Charlie Towns gave him a job earning $35 a week, studying alcoholics and drug addicts. And he came up with a theory. Came up with a theory that we have an obsession of the mind coupled with an allergy of the body. 1933, Bud Firestone goes back to Akron, and he is tickled to death to be sober. He's a happy boy. And he's been the eyesore of that Firestone family. Big embarrassment. And his daddy was so tickled that he invited the Oxford group members to come to this new architectural wonder called the Mayflower Hotel that had just been built in downtown Akron. And he gave a dinner, a sit-down dinner for 300 Oxford group members. It was front page news in Akron, Ohio. And it made the news up there for weeks. And over in Akron, there's this guy named Reverend Walter Tunks, non-alcoholic. He's a minister there. And this chick named Henrietta Seiberling, she was the estranged wife of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company magnate. But they're members of the Oxford groups. He meets another couple of people named Henrietta and T. Henry and Clarice Williams, and this is where the Oxford group members met at these house parties. Middle of 1933, we're back up in New York City. Roland comes back, and he's active at the Oxford groups at Calvary Church. He meets Sam Shoemaker. He meets a guy named Shep Cornell, another guy by the name of Sebra Graves, and he meets Jim Newton. He's active at Oxford groups in New York City. Come down to the fall of 1933. Bill Wilson makes his first visit to Towns Hospital. He meets Dr. Silkworth, and he undergoes the belladonna treatment, and this is the first of 4 visits. He goes in there, and he kind of gets stable for a minute, but we know that he didn't stay sober. Dr. Bob has been hammered by his... let me find this here real quick. There's Roland, and this is Towns Hospital. Dr. Bob has been hammered by his wife, Ann. She said, there's a group of people that seem to be stable, happy, and productive here in Akron. They're the Oxford group movement, and I'd love it if you'd go to some of these meetings with me. And he's willing to do anything to get her off of his butt. And he starts going to Oxford groups, and he goes 2.5 years, but he's getting sliced every night after the meetings. And he's still drinking. This is top of 34. The middle of 1934, there's a guy by the name of Ebby Thatcher. That's Ebby, the little short fellow there. Ebby's another one of these white-collar industrialists, got plenty of money. They're from Albany. I almost said Rochester. Albany, New York. Came from a family that manufactured railway wheels for railway cars. Bunch of politicians too. He's about to be committed for alcoholic insanity. This guy, Seaber Graves' father, is sitting on the bench. Judge Collins Graves and Roland Hazard and a couple of other guys show up in court and ask the judge to suspend his commitment and turn him over to them. They were going to make him a project of this new solution that they had. Judge Graves says, you know, Roland, you come from a good family. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't do it. I'd send him away. But he gave him over to Roland and took him over to the Oxford groups at Calvary Church. And when there, he hears about the solution, the spiritual solution. And he hears about the practical program of action. There's no AA yet. But he finds out that if he will carry this message yet to others, he has a good chance of staying sober. And he said, well, I know just a cat to go talk to. My old drinking buddy, Bill Wilson. December the 11th, 1934. Bill's last drink. He sat on the steps of Towns Hospital, knocked back a few beers, and he goes into Towns Hospital. He's been visited by Ebby. It's December the 11th. December the 11th, 1934. Armistice Day. No, that's November the 11th. Anyway, December the 11th, that's Bill's sobriety date. Now keep in mind, Ebby has visited Bill. And Bill looks at this man, and there's something indescribably different about his old drinking buddy. He says, what's happened to you? And told him, he says, I got religion. He says, if you can tap into a power greater than yourselves, you don't ever have to drink again, Bill. And once you do that, you carry this message to others. This is his fourth visit. And in the course of these 4 visits, Dr. Silkworth has told Bill, this is where the goosebumps, I've been doing this 18 years and it gets me every time. Silkworth told him, he says, Bill, I've got this theory that you have an obsession of the mind. He said, let me ask you something, Bill. What happens when you start thinking about drinking? He says, I drink every time. He says, and when you start drinking, what happens? He says, I drink until I pass out, till I get separated from alcohol. He says, that's the allergy. Bill said, I'll be damned. And then Ebby visits him. He says, if you have a vital spiritual experience and carry this message to others, you can get and stay sober. At this very moment in time, Bill Wilson is the only human being on the planet Earth that knows all 3 things. He knows about the problem, learned it from Silkworth. He knows about the solution that was brought back from Roland and passed on to Ebby. And he learned about the practical program of action. Bill began working the steps on the 4th day. Not the 4th month or the 4th year. He worked them while he was still in the hospital, coming out of delirium tremens. Top of 1935, Dr. Bob Smith still going to the Oxford groups with Tunks and Ann, his wife. Henrietta Seiberling, still drinking. Henrietta Seiberling came to him one night and said, Bob, we know that you got a drinking problem. Would you like for us to hold a special prayer session for you and ask for manna from heaven? He said, yes, I would. So they held a special prayer meeting for Dr. Bob Smith, and they asked for God's intervention. Bill goes back over at the same time. Bill goes back to the hospital, and he tells Silkworth, he says, I don't know why the hell I keep doing this. Ain't nobody getting sober. Silkworth says, you are. He says, the problem, Bill, is you're going out here in the Boweries, the bar rooms and the alleys of New York City, beating these drunks over the head with the Bible, and they're not putting up with it. Quit preaching to them, Bill. Tell them what I told you. Tell them about the obsession of the mind and the allergy of the body. Tell them about what your friend Ebby said. about a vital spiritual experience, tell them what I told you, Bill. Bill goes to Akron, Ohio on a business deal that gets sideways. Deal fails. Bill's got $15 in his pocket. He can't pay the bill at the Mayflower Hotel. And he knows what has worked all this time. There's the lobby of the Mayflower, and that directory's still hanging there. And he went over to that directory. This is not Hollywood. This isn't that Bill, my name is Bill W., where he got a handful of nickels and made all them calls. Bill went over to that directory, and he looked at it, and he found the name Reverend Walter Tunks. And here's the reason he chose that man's name. In the Northeast, when you go for a walk, they call it taking a tunk. He and Lois loved to take a tunk. And he thought, coincidence? He calls up Reverend Tunks, and he says, I'm a rumhound from New York, and I need to talk to another drunk. He says, why are you calling me? He says, I'm not a drunk. He says, but I think I got just the person for you. And he gave him the phone number of Henrietta. Now, keep in mind, they had just prayed for God's intervention. And he says, Miss Seiberling, this is Bill Wilson. I'm an alcoholic from New York City, and I need to talk to another drunk. She says, I got just the cat. She called Ann and Bob, and Ann says, he's sick. He's been out drinking. This is May the 11th. And she said, can you bring him over here tomorrow? Or can you come tomorrow? And he said, absolutely. So it's May the 12th, 1935. On the way to the Seiberling mansion, Bob told Ann, he says, I'm going to go talk to this cat. He says, but I'm sick, Ann. You got to promise me in 15 minutes you'll come beat on that door and get me out of there. I'm sick. She said, Bob, I'll do anything if you'll just go talk to this man. We can't go on like this. And they walked into this little room. Again, you've seen the movie. This is the real room. It's about an 8 by 8. Charlie and I took this picture, as you can see, on June the 11th of 2009. And they sat in those chairs. And what started out to be a 15-minute conversation ended up to be 6 hours. Bob reached his hand across the table and he said, Mr. Wilson, I don't know what you think you can do for me. I've been prayed over and carved up more than a Christmas goose. Bill doffed his hat and he says, I'm not here for you, Dr. Bob. I'm here for me because I don't want to get drunk no more. What I would invite you to do tonight when you go back home, look at this timeline. Take your ink, take your highlighter, take your magic marker, and cross out any date, any city, any event, or any human being. We're not here tonight. This was a divinely inspired timeline as you trace it back, and it actually goes back further than this. But this is how we're here tonight, because of all these people, these dates, these places, and the events that took place. Y'all have any questions on the timeline? Let's take 10 minutes and be back at 5 after, please.